In the first week of class, I showed you a chord chart. At first, maybe it was a bit hard to comprehend it, but I showed you how it essentially outlines the kinds of chord progressions that you find in classical music. And we saw some features of classical music, like everything leads back to one, that usually you have a 5 before you go to 1, a dominant chord before you go to 1. But the circle of fifths, for instance, was very important. And there's one more thing that chord chart shows, and that is that substitution is possible. We saw on the right-hand side of that chart that there was a 4 chord and underneath it a 2 chord, a 5 chord and underneath that a 7 diminished chord. So in this week 4, I want to talk about diatonic substitution and how we can actually make harmonic progressions more interesting by using substitutions of chords rather than the chords that we've always been using. Let's start off with the 1-5-1 chord progression. In the end, what we're going to try to do is substitute the 5 chord for a 7 diminished chord. Well, let's first look at these chords next to each other and understand why it is that we can actually substitute them. I'll do this here. If I take the If I take that chord, and then I take, so this is the 5 chord, and this is the 7 diminished chord. Right, we're in D minor again. What do I see? Well, first of all, I see that I have 2 common tones. In fact, I can do this to show that we have these 2 common tones. Oops. And we have one chord tone, one note that's different between them. And interestingly, if I bring this one down, so I can do this right here, we see that they're only a step apart. We also see that this note itself is actually the 7th of a dominant 7th chord. So there's your dominant 7th chord in 3rd inversion. That is, this would be a 5-4-2 chord. So we see how many similarities there are. In fact, let's take this. Let's give ourselves a 1 chord here. Whoops, not what I wanted. Let's give ourselves a 1 chord. And then let's make a 5 chord. And then let's go back to 1. And then let's just cut and paste this thing. This is a 7 diminished triad, right? But if I put it here, then I get a dominant 7th chord. Yeah, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th. And then we resolve it. Back to there. Sorry, I'll do this quickly. Like that. Here's our leading tone. It should actually go up here, but it's in an inner voice, so we'll have it jump down. Also, this is keyboard writing. Keyboard writing, this is completely fine. Good. So we see what a close similarity there is, what a close kinship, so to speak, there is between the 5 chord and the 7 diminished chord. So let's try to use this 7 diminished chord instead. Let's use this upper part, but not have the root of the 5 chord. So how do we do that? Well, let me give an example. First thing I want to say is the following. This thing, where you get root position 5 chord, you don't see much. Let me show you why. Let's go to this chord. Let's voice lead it appropriately. We'll get this double leading tone. So we don't want that. We want to avoid having double leading tone. Why? Because leading tones, look, they're in the outer voices, right? This is a particularly bad example. I mean, there are cases where you could avoid this. So I'm sort of setting up a situation that demonstrates the worst that you could possibly do. So you've got these outer voices that are both leading tones, which forces them to resolve both to the tonic, which means we need to do this, and we immediately get parallel octaves. Okay, so what do we do instead? Well, let's do this. So maybe I throw in some Roman numerals here. We're in the key of D. Sorry, I didn't write that down, but and this is 7 diminished, and this is 1. And like I said, this one you're not going to see very often in root position. How are we going to see it? We're usually going to see it in first inversion. Are you going to see it in second inversion? You might find it in second inversion as a kind of passing chord at times, but that's about it. So mostly this 7 diminished chord, you're going to want to put into first inversion, which makes voice leading it actually fairly easy. This works just fine. Now, this thing here though, and let me play it back for you so you can hear. I'll go from the very beginning so you can hear this 1-5-1, and then you can hear the 1-7 diminished 6 to 1. You'll hear how similar they sound. In fact, if you're not listening very closely, you might actually mistake this as some kind of 5 chord. Perhaps you'd hear this in the bass and say, ah, that's a 5-6-4, for instance. They have a really similar sound. Nonetheless, they are different. And I should say that this 1 going to 7 diminished 6 back to 1, that one you're going to see much less frequently than this, where it does function as a kind of passing chord. You get something like that. And of course, we can't have this. We see we have parallel octaves here between bass and tenor, so to speak. So we just have to do that. This progression, 1, 7 diminished 6 to 1, 6, where this 7 diminished 6 acts as a kind of passing chord, this is usually how you see this. So if you're going to be using the 7 diminished triad as a substitute for 5 or 5-7, know that this is probably the progression you want to use. Will you see this? Yeah, you'll see this. And even, well, much less frequently, but you will see root position 7. Although again, it's very, very infrequent. So you will see this, and you could use this, but this is the one that's really characteristic of the music that we're looking at. One question that might arise then is that, well, if you have a dominant triad that can be substituted with a leading tone diminished triad, the 7 diminished triad, could we not do the same thing with the dominant 7th chord and substitute that with a leading tone 7th chord, the 7 fully diminished 7, let's say? And the answer is actually yes. So let's, for instance, get this down here. If we build a leading tone, that's the 7 fully diminished 7 chord here, we see again we have 3 notes in common, and then there's going to be this 1 that's different. And notice, just like in the last example, there was a step difference between the A and the G. If we do this, we see that there's only a semitone difference between this A and this B flat. So this is the root, and this is the 7th of this fully diminished 7th chord. But what it means is if you're substituting, you just shift this from where it is, the root, from where it is, up by a semitone. And in fact, you see composers play with this all the time. So let's sort of realize it a bit. Let's create a 1-5-7-1 progression. Something like this, and we'll put it in we'll put this chord in first inversion. Oops. Okay. Very quickly, I'll do some analysis. 1. We have 5, 6, 5, right? It's a dominant 7th chord in first inversion. And there you have it. So that's our analysis of this. And let's say we want to substitute this. Let's hear it first. Well, let's say that we want to have a substitution. Instead of this 5, 6, 5, we actually want a 7 fully diminished 7. That's no problem. And again, if we use the follow procedure that I just mentioned, here all you have to do is you find the root and move it up by a semitone. So here we have the root, right? We move it up by a semitone. And then if we look at the intervals, we see we have the root, we see we have the third. Sorry, if we look at the intervals, if we look at the notes, we have the root, we have the third, 5th, and 7th. And we have nice voice leading as well. And of course, this is no longer this. We have 7 diminished to 7. And now let me play this so you can hear the difference between the two. It's not a huge difference. That's often the case with substitutions. It's subtle, but it's still very noticeable, and this chord certainly has a different color than this chord does.